At 7 a.m. Eastern Time, 12 p.m. BST, every day of the week, where we discuss all things to do with the modern market. That is the crypto market, the NFT market, and how to make some or a lot of money on the internet. I'm your host, Bcheck. I'm joined by my legendary co-host, Sammy. We've got all kinds of stuff to get into today. Some interesting developments coming out of Bitcoin Nashville, some important snippets of news which we want to dive into. Getting pretty excited about that event actually, and Trump obviously coming to appear there. I suspect there'll be some big headlines coming out there soon. We're going to be talking about that in just a little bit, but just a reminder, friends, that nothing that we say here, unfortunately, is financial advice because we do not know anything for sure. So please do proceed with caution and exercise your own judgment. We're participating in a very risky market. So with that out of the way, Sammy, it is Friday. It's the 26th of July. How are you doing? How are you feeling?
TGIF. I am settling in, ready for the Cambria playtest, which is 3 days long. So over this weekend, I'll be doing that. And yeah, just seeing some emerging trends coming through, which is pretty interesting on the wider gaming side of things, which we'll touch on shortly.
Nice. So we're going to get into a little bit of the gaming side of things, which I think is probably fair to say the gaming stuff's taken a bit of a hit recently, at least in terms of public perception and how people have thought that's been going. But it is still going, right? Like there's still people building out on that side of things. Have you noticed anything in particular?
Well, there's a lot of different types of gaming trends. I mean, you look at the Telegram stuff. That's just sort of doesn't take much or brain capacity to actually play those.
Sure.
And those sort of idle games are very popular among people that just want to chill and just don't want to think about stuff for a prolonged period of time. So that stuff's exploding. But some of this other stuff, the MMORPGs, so the likes of Cambria, Moonfrost, which we'll touch on shortly. Yeah, there's just like a number of games that have been funded back in 2021 that are coming through, and they're actually coming into sort of alpha or beta modes, ready for games or players to play, which is good, really cool.
Interesting. Okay. So looking forward to a little bit of an update on that side. We'll also have, as I said, the structure of the show today, we'll do the normal headlines. We'll get into a bit of an NFT market update, interesting discussion points for the day where we're going to look at the themes of the week and see which bits we consider to be the most important moving forward. And then we'll hit the headlines as usual. And interesting discussion to pick up from yesterday's show with Ovi, where he kind of was suggesting that Bitcoin as an asset is becoming more interesting to him. It's like bounced really nicely. I just saw the price action today. So let's get into the price action and the headlines. As always, this is coming from the snapshot, which is pinned up top on the Twitter Spaces. But remember, we're live on X video and YouTube video if that's where you prefer to consume your live media. I'm going to share the screen now for the people who are watching the video. Let's get into it, starting with some price action. Bitcoin is up almost 5%, back to 67K. ETH up almost 2%, back to 3.2K. Solana up almost 6% to almost $180. That's the majors for you. In terms of the headlines, number one, Franklin Templeton and SBI team up to bring Bitcoin ETFs to Japan. So the Bitcoin ETF seems to be expanding continuously at the moment. A lot of Bitcoin headlines, unsurprisingly, given that it is Bitcoin Nashville. One interview which has emerged is RFK announcing he would have the Fed buy Bitcoin to the point where the amount is equivalent to the US gold holdings. Tyler reminded us that the US has $579 billion of gold and just $13 billion of Bitcoin. So that would be a massive amount of buy pressure. I think that's a nice headline, but obviously I don't think many people attach much uh, percentage chance to RFK actually coming into power. But this idea seems to be taking hold that a proportion of dollars should be allocated to a strategic reserve asset. So it's interesting to have that amount be kind of put out there into the universe. We want to discuss that in a little bit. And then another interesting point coming from BlackRock's head of digital assets at the conference said there will not be a long list of crypto ETFs. Obviously, they've brought to market the Bitcoin and Ether ones, suggesting that that should be it for now. We want to dive into that. I know a lot of people will feel a particular way about that. So we'll dive into the details there. Some other notable sales from around the space: Sam Spratt's Skull of Lucy selling for 85 ETH, and two reasonable X copy sales, the B selling for 17.3, X copy Gobble selling for 12.5 ETH. One correction from yesterday's show, we were discussing a Skull of Lucy selling for like 25 ETH or something like that. That was a mistake on the front end of Mintify. What that was actually showing was a loan being taken out, because on Mintify you can actually track loans that are getting taken against these high value assets. So that was actually a loan being taken out on Arcade against the Skull of Lucy, and this is really the price that those trade at. So huge sale for Sam Spratt on the secondary market. Skull of Lucy going to the artist Batsu for 85 ETH. So big sale there. Sam, that is the price action. Those are the headlines. Before we get into what I think will be a pretty Bitcoin focused show with all the headlines coming out of Nashville, is there anything that's catching your attention in the market?
Well, actually, before we get into the Mintify heat map, just a note on those X copy sales. I think for those that watched the Proof podcast, I think there was I think OSF and Raoul Powell went on that yesterday, and they were talking deeply about X copy being like the OGR, and maybe those funds might flow into that. So I do wonder whether people watched that and thought, actually, yeah, that's a good idea, and we'll buy up some X copies just to cover that instead. So
I think that's a reasonable point. The thing, I know you're going to go into the NFT market stuff in a second, but the thing that I've noticed with Xcopy, probably the last 2 to 3 months, frankly, there's just like routinely very, very healthy secondary market sales for Xcopy. By far and away, the most healthily collected digitally native artists. I think Sam Spratt also routinely commands very, very high prices, but I think Xcopy above and beyond, because I think he's got more work out there as well, seems to command the most. So very, very healthy activity, but good to note that Ovi and Raoul have been very, very bullish on Xcopy for a while, I think.
So people as well, I think you probably add to that same thing. People are looking for provenance. I think seeking those items that have that cultural value as well as the historical relevance, I think is super important. So I can see like a theme coming through there. But yeah, just on the price action on the Mintify heat map, I think it was Moonshot that seems to have popped on. Now this is a game that was funded back in 2021. I think it's been in development for about 2.5 years. And these are the hunter licenses, which I think are like gaming passes to play this beta that is like a closed alpha or beta game that launches on 29th of July. And I've noticed that Apex and a few of the other gaming KOLs have been talking about this game for the past year or so. So it'd be super interesting to see how that does and if there's serious demand for it. Because if you've got 45,000 players or supposed players, it could be wallets like ready to play. That shows some level of demand, which is super interesting. But just on that note, I've just pinned to the Jumbotron a post I made last year around VC funding for Web3 gaming. And I've kind of categorized it by, so you'll see for those that are on X, you'll be able to look at that as well. But you'll see that there's a lot of, I think there's the red stuff is discontinued games. So games that have kind of run out of funding and stopped playing. So you would have seen that back in April last year. I guess they've been in a bear market for kind of 18 months. We're struggling a little bit, so kind of packed up a lot of the way through. But you'll also see a significant number that were in development still, and some that were coming live. And I think just seeing that's probably 9 months ago I made this. So you're going to see a lot more games coming to market. And there was a thesis that if all it would take is one sort of Web3 game to hit the mass audience for people to come flooding in. And actually we're seeing a lot of Web3 games offering, it could just be like rather than having crypto, they're now integrating Privy. They're now integrating like other wallets that don't necessarily need crypto in them. You can pay with fiat or credit cards. So you're kind of getting this open to a wider audience. And Cambria, they've got their playtest this weekend for 3 days. They've got sponsored. So as in like some of the players are sponsoring other players to play. So it covers the cost of their mint pass, which is only 0.01 ETH. Everyone's on a level playing field, but it means that those that don't necessarily want to pay, but just want to play can do. And they split the rewards with the people that sponsor them. And I think eventually it will get to a point where it'll just be credit cards to play the game, do a season pass, and there's like a leaderboard of rewards to play that game. And I think we're going to see that across a lot of other games as well. And I think Play Ember is one that we're relatively close with. They're doing sort of casual gaming. So it's just super interesting. It'd be interesting to see maybe Q4 of this year when these games are a little bit more developed and kind of opening up to the wider audience, whether they're going to be some hits that come through.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. One of the things that your explanation kind of got me thinking about, and I was actually talking about this at a dinner yesterday, is this idea, like there seems to be this phrase called consumer crypto. I don't know if this phrase existed before necessarily. Some people might have been around longer than me. But this phrase called consumer crypto, which is coming around now, where you know the idea is that you're supposed to make things that people want to use, right? Like, and I'm just wondering, why was that not the thing before? Like, I don't know if I'm being really naive about this, but it seems to be like a revolutionary idea right now that you're meant to meant to build things that people are going to use, and that's called consumer crypto. It's like, well, what were we doing before? Like, what on earth was going on beforehand that meant that we were not doing consumer crypto? Like, we were just doing other random stuff. And this idea that I'm just not entirely certain that the things that you know, the idea that we should make things easier for people. Like, for example, there's this Moonshot app, I think, recently where people were saying, like, oh, wow, it's so good that you can now buy the coins with a credit card and you don't need to download the Phantom wallet. You don't need to download MetaMask. You don't need to download all this stuff. You just, you download the app and you just buy the stuff. And look, I appreciate there's probably regulatory things which might have been the blocker for those things. So that might actually be the case. Um, but yeah, this was my core thought in the last few days. So like, even when you're talking about these games, like making it easy for people or like making it cheap for people, it's like, well, yeah, of course. Why has that not been happening up to this point?
I think
What
with games, it's slightly different though, because the game has to be fun. And I think back in 2021, a lot of these games were so focused on the tech, like let's try and create these NFTs and then build a game around it. It's like, well, it's actually pretty hard to build a game. And I think that's probably the same for a lot of these other industries back in 2021, where it's like, shit, this is an NFT. You can own digital real estate, which is such a novel thing that we could never have done before. So I think that digital scarcity became the focus as opposed to looking for those problems and trying to solve them with solutions rather than the other way around. What they were doing was like, well, this is a solution to something. Let's go see if we can find the problem. And I think it's kind of shifting that perspective. And it's probably taken us 2-3 years to get to that point where it's actually like, okay, well, we were looking at this the wrong way. They're a good tool. They're a good potential solution, but they're not the solution to everything.
Yeah. Just a quick check-in for the people. I think we're okay. Funky seems to have lost sound on the space itself. It might just be you, Funky, because we're not getting any messages from anyone else. So if you just drop off and drop back in, hopefully you'll be okay. Oxy's saying it's completely fine. Yeah. So yeah, back to the point on the consumer thing. My only argument against myself would be the regulation thing, right? Look, it wasn't possible to build for consumer because of regulations. But the thing is, there's still no proper clarity from a regulatory perspective, which makes me think the concept of consumer crypto now just seems, I just don't get it. I don't get why it wasn't that before. Because regulation still hasn't come, which means that the concept just seems like a strangely phrased thing that, oh, we're going to make stuff really easy for people to use. We're going to build stuff that people want. It's like, well, what were we doing before? What on earth was happening before? And I think this is one of the challenging things where I don't know, the last few days, last few weeks, been wondering, like, the core thesis for crypto, or the core use cases, cross-border global payments, everything else. And yes, you've got this trading game where people, there's extreme amounts of value that you can make in all of the trading stuff. So smart contracts has been a huge unlock. So for financial transactions and financial instruments and financial things, it's also very, very helpful because of the creation of the smart contract, which is going to cut out loads and loads of middlemen. So cross-border payments, smart contracts for financial transactions. But in terms of actual apps, like, shouldn't they just be good apps? And, there doesn't need to be this crypto aspect hitting people in the face. It should just be a good app. And if it wants to run crypto on the back end, then that's okay.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think that ultimately you get down to the crux of it. It's disintermediation, which is effectively you're kind of automating stuff to reduce the cost for hopefully the end user. Whereas a lot like the issue historically, and I think with NFT specifically, the issue originally was like, okay, well, these middlemen are effectively taking huge cuts from artists and creators, which was such a big value proposition in 2021. And you had an influx of artists creating stuff as NFTs. And I think that's been the case for a lot of other industries, but to a lesser extent. I completely agree with you. Like it's consumer crypto. Maybe it is just another word for mass adoption, but mass adoption got so overused that like it just doesn't make sense. And I think that yes, the ETFs are coming through, and that's kind of approval but they're regulated investors a lot of the time. Like a lot of UK people can't actually buy these ETFs. I think in Europe you potentially can, but you have to be like an approved investor to be able to do that. And I think maybe at some point that regulatory clarity is going to come here. But I do think that you have individuals that, well, the regulators for a start have begun to say that a lot of these coins are potentially commodities, which is kind of going down that route. And maybe that means that it's kind of alluding to better regulatory clarity. And I do think that opens the doors for that phrase like consumer crypto to become more acceptable. So I think it's getting there, but I think it is a journey, and it's probably going to take another year or so just to get to some sort of regulated clarity for the retail consumer.
Okay, I think that's fair. I'm just calling it out. I'm calling it out and asking people to be aware of this terminology that's being used. Which, and you actually break it down, I don't know what it means fully. Like I don't know what it means, and I think it's been like widely accepted somehow in the last few months, maybe the last 6 months to a year, even, as if that's something that we need to pursue. When actually, I just don't get it. I think it's a vacuous term. I
I
want
think, I
people
think, I
to
think,
think about
well,
it
I
more.
mean, it's good though, because you're using critical thinking, right? You're like, well, is this something novel? And it's probably not. And I think that's using your legal background to sort of challenge things. And similar to me, like having a professional skepticism hat, like it's useful sometimes. But
Yeah.
I do think that specifically with Pudgies as an example, they've got product market fit with getting stuff into Walmart. They're making sales. Yes, originally it's probably to their core Pudgy holders, but it seems to be breaking out of that. And I think that consumer focus, that retail focus, where they are actually demonstrating that they're getting to that point, I can kind of see why that is kind of put under the guise of consumer crypto, because it kind of makes sense. But the terminology for the broader market doesn't make sense in every little niche.
Yeah.
I think it just has to be specific in which instance you use that phrase.
Yeah, let's see. I hope there's an interesting kind of question that I brought up so people can think about the term and how it's being applied in different cases. As you say, maybe there's some cases where it's better applied and some cases where it's just like, I don't know if that's the right way that you would attach something to that phrase. But anyway, that was an interesting discussion. I want to go into maybe just some themes of the week as we get to Friday, try and get a bit of a sense of where we've been. I just published my 132nd NFT/crypto market newsletter. If you want to subscribe, it's in the link in my bio. Just trying to take people through the key things that I think has happened in the week. Number one, ETFs do $1 billion in volume, but ultimately they seem to have underperformed other majors still. Ovi was on the show yesterday, prominent trader, OSF, said, ETH's got maybe 4 to 6 weeks to prove itself now and show that it's not going to continue to underperform. So we'll definitely be monitoring that. Next, Hamilton Lane. We mentioned this yesterday on the show. $900 billion asset manager launches a private credit fund. Pudgy Penguins chain Igloo raises $11 million for Abstract Chain, led by Peter Thiel's Founders Fund. We noticed that meme coins, you can now short with leverage with dumpy.fun. That's something we're going to have a look out for. And then also this Mockaverse news, the partnership with the Ton Foundation, where they're doing this token swap. I think that's going to be really important moving forward to see how big DAOs with huge token allocations will seek to work with each other and swap tokens with each other in order to kind of participate in each other's ecosystem. So I thought that was very interesting. And then on the NFT side, 99 Retardio cousin NFTs were swept for $300,000. And just the broader thing, the key question, I even asked this to our friend at dinner yesterday, like what's going on with that Milady family of NFTs? They just keep going up as other things either stand still or kind of are struggling. They seem to be proliferating as well. They'll just keep making more of them on different chains, and they keep going up. So those are my reflections there. The key themes of the week, Sam. What are you thinking if you have to take one of these and run with it? What's kind of the key thing on your mind as you see us going for the next few weeks, next few months?
Well, the Retardio cousin thing, that is super interesting to me, because we touched on that yesterday about manufacturing culture.
Yeah,
And I just don't think this is just like organic. I think that if you think back to Bored Apes in sort of early 2021, like they were launched, they kind of got into the various hands of people. They had significant demand for them. They then sort of airdropped the various other sort of collections, and it seemed to still sustain that demand. And I think this is like another case where this is kind of a similar instance to an extent. I know they're separate collections, but for those that are priced out of Miladies, went to Remedios, and those that are priced out of Remedios have gone to this. And I think these are now 23 sol, 22 and a half sol,
yeah,
which is not an insignificant amount of money. So yeah, like I think it just makes sense from a cultural perspective. Like it just clicks with those guys on the internet that yeah, just naturally building culture. And it's not for everyone, but it does kind of put a middle finger to the institutions and things like that. It just goes against what is the status quo.
yeah.
I think we'll see more of that. And I know there's is it UNFK? I don't know if you've seen that as well. But you'll probably see that on the timeline quite a lot over the next month or so, which is kind of that anti-establishment point. So it's definitely a bit of an uprising.
It's like the anti-establishment to the anti-establishment, which is pretty crazy.
Yeah.
That we're just going deeper and deeper. At some point, there'll be a counterculture to this counterculture, right?
Yeah, well,
Um,
I guess that's the thing, though. Once it becomes too common, then it's no longer anti, is it? It's like it
yeah.
becomes the status quo. So you then have people that want to rebel against that. So yeah, I completely agree.
Mm. Interesting stuff. Okay, well, that's a nice little update from the kind of the weekly update of all the things that I thought was useful to pick out from the last 7 days or so. Let's get into the headlines from the last 24 hours. As I said, definitive Bitcoin focus in the last 24 hours, as some pieces of news were coming out of Bitcoin Nashville, which I think will be very helpful to discuss. Maybe the first one, which we can just deal with, which direction should we take this? Let's go to the RFK news first, where he said, let me just find this on the article. So I'm going to share this on screen for the people who are watching in. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. proposes massive Bitcoin reserve for the US government. This is reported on Yahoo Finance. In a recent interview, presidential candidate Robert F. Kennedy Jr. suggested that the federal government should acquire enough Bitcoin to match the value of the nation's gold reserves. This comes as speculation mounts about President Donald Trump's intentions to establish a US Bitcoin reserve. Kennedy, as you know, is an independent candidate, shared his vision during a conversation with Custodia Bank CEO. He emphasized the integrity of Bitcoin as a currency, noting its decentralized nature and transparency. Bitcoin is an honest currency, Kennedy stated. It's based on proof of work. Everything is on the ledger. And that's what we need to do with democracy. A bit more context on this. The US government currently holds 8,134 tons of gold valued at approximately $615 billion. To match this value in Bitcoin, the government would need to procure around 9.4 million Bitcoin at current prices, which represents nearly 45% of the total Bitcoin supply. We haven't checked those numbers. That's coming from Yahoo Finance. So the scale of what RFK is proposing is obviously very significant. I also saw a little clip of him from when he was being interviewed at the karate combat event yesterday, saying that the majority of his wealth, I think he said, was in Bitcoin, which is pretty interesting to hear. Sammy, what are your thoughts here on this? Now, obviously, RFK is like unlikely. I think people are reasonable to say is unlikely to become president himself. But this concept of the US having a strategic reserve of Bitcoin seems to be catching on. Obviously, people are anticipating Trump's speech with great anticipation. Don't know what he's going to say. What's your thought on this concept that's kind of catching a bit of attention here?
I mean, the concept makes sense to me. I mean, digital scarcity, yeah, like like if you compare gold to Bitcoin, like the risk with gold is you have these asteroids that suddenly start being mined, and all of a sudden gold is no longer scarce. So actually holding gold in reserve isn't going to hold as much value as potentially holding something that is literally digitally scarce.
Sure.
So I think in terms of future proofing the nation and their reserves, that kind of makes sense. Because I know like Musk has talked about asteroid mining, going to Mars, like as if it's a pretty close thing to be happening within the next, I don't know how many years, like 10, 20 years, like next couple of decades. So I think that by doing this, it kind of, yeah, it solidifies that it could potentially be a transition at some point. The numbers, like I get that the 45% number, but I think the whole value of Bitcoin, like by its nature, I think it's going to go up significantly more. So I don't think they're going to need anywhere near as much as that just to hold it in reserve. But then that's pretty bullish for anyone that's individual that's holding it as well, as long as you don't have it seized or whatever. And I think maybe looking at to see how some of these other nations respond to it, because I think if you look at how the US accumulated that Bitcoin, I think it was Bitfinex, that hack, and also the Silk Road hack. That was a significant portion of the 210k Bitcoin that they hold in reserve. So it'll be interesting to see like how other nations respond and whether there's a bit of a battle to counter that, because there's not 45% Bitcoin available to be accumulated for a start. So
yeah, I mean that's kind of secretly the hope of everyone, right? Like everyone just gets into this crazy Bitcoin's arms race where no one can have enough ultimately if it becomes some type of reserve. Did you want to say something else?
yeah, well, I think you've also got to think that, okay, the US government would hold it in reserve, but then because they hold it in reserve, you've got the IMF that then it needs to hold a certain amount in reserve as well. So it's not just the individual nations. I think once one nation does it, and I know El Salvador is already doing it, but they then have to hold these other sort of like organizations that span those countries, national boundaries, also have to do it as well. So I think just understanding what happens and the knock-on effects to those kind of policies and things like that could be super interesting.
Yeah, and the thing is, there's all kind of corporate knock-on effects. Like obviously, I mean, one of the other pieces of news from the snapshot today, which we'll kind of get to later, is another company. I believe it was two companies. Well, Marathon Digital Holdings announced they're going to buy $100 million worth of Bitcoin, or that they have bought it. And then separate to that, the mayor of New Jersey announces a pension fund to allocate 2% to Bitcoin, which is the second pension fund in the States to allocate a proportion to Bitcoin after the Wisconsin one. So it's like there's just a whole host of knock-on effects, even on the smallest level possible when it comes to ourselves, like us as a company. I was looking at the treasury the other day, and it's like, okay, well, if you've got a certain amount in cash, that's good. There's a certain amount in cash which you obviously need to cover various expenses. But then does every corporation, no matter what level, start to think, well, do you know what? Any excess, you don't want to be holding in cash, right? Like you need the amount of cash that you need to cover, I don't know how many months that you think would be optimal to cover yourself from an operational perspective. But beyond that, if you have like excess at any point in time, do you just want to keep parking it in Bitcoin? I don't know. I think those are the kind of conversations that people will start to think of more and more. Interesting comment from Nu in the Twitter comments, which I actually do agree with. And I was wondering about this for a second. what was Satoshi's vision of Bitcoin? Question mark. I'm not quite sure that's the direction we're heading. I have heard people kind of express far more, or just a little bit of discontent, a bit of skepticism about all of this stuff, in essence, being co-opted by the TradFi system, right? Like the whole point of this, and this is actually why Peter Thiel, I saw an interview with him the other day. Peter Thiel, obviously legendary investor, and the person who's created the Founders Fund, which is investing a lot in the space, said that he'd sold off a bunch of his Bitcoin because he's not sure that the vision of Bitcoin as it stands, or like the direction Bitcoin is going, is not necessarily in keeping with that initial vision, which was very kind of rebellious and anti-establishment and establishing itself in that way. Whereas now it's kind of becoming a TradFi asset, and that's a very, very different thing. So Sam, wanted to give you a chance to come back on that, and then Funky's hand is raised, T Rose hand is raised. Would love to hear from them in a moment.
Yeah, I think the global financial crisis back in 2008, and then I think Satoshi brought it in, I think it was 2009, January 2009. Like it was that self-sovereignty, because he was concerned, or they were concerned, that the banking system was like, it wasn't acting in the best interests and like of retail consumers and things. So that self-sovereignty was super important. So yeah, it's interesting to see how many years on, like 15 years on from that, which is crazy. It's been that long, but that things have kind of shifted, and actually traditional finance is now adopting the asset that was kind of invented to counter what they were doing and kind of disintermediate them. So I do wonder whether it's a bit of a defense tactic though, like because they are genuinely concerned that this is actually a better asset class than like traditional assets, financial instruments. So they've just adopted it because they are concerned. So it's like a defense tactic to protect themselves.
Well, sure. I mean, if you wanted to protect yourself against it, why not just get right involved in it and be able to sway decision making and buy the right people? I mean, this is the same thing that anyone would do. You try to buy, you buy a stake in the thing that you're trying to control, and then you try to influence people at the same time. So I'm definitely not opposed to that idea. Look, I want to go to Funky on maybe more the Bitcoin side of things and maybe some of these knock-on effects. But I believe Tiro is actually in Bitcoin Nashville, and this show is called Bitcoin Nashville Huge Updates. So Tiro, welcome to the stage, my friend. Would love to get your take on the news that we've just been talking about in terms of Bitcoin potentially being the reserve asset, but also just what does it feel like on the ground? What have you noticed? What's been said? Anything key that we have missed so far?
Yeah, 100%. Good morning, B Check in the modern market. Being on the feet on the ground in Nashville, a lot of anticipation, a lot of rich.
I can't hear you very well, Tiro. I don't know if your volume is. I don't know if that's just me.
I think I can hear him okay.
Okay, sorry. Carry on. Then it should be fine.
Okay, so Nashville is anticipation is high. I was at Karate Combat last night. RFK was getting chants of RFK. If his name was Michael Smith, I don't think anyone would be talking to him. Kennedys are a higher level
sure
political being here. It's interesting. I saw Hawk to a girl. She was ringside. Also, Thread Guy was there as well, dressing like a walking thrift store, like he always
as
is.
Usual.
He's out there doing his thing. But the RFK piece about Bitcoin, he has no power. He'll be lucky to get less, probably 2% of the vote here in America. So for the United States to have 45% of Bitcoin would be absolutely insane. RFK is speaking at Nashville today at 4 p.m.
Okay.
Trump is speaking tomorrow at 2 p.m. Also, we have Kathy Wood today and Michael Saylor as well. So a lot of headliners that I'm really interested to see on the Nakamoto stage, which is a large stage in Nashville. So
that's awesome, man.
Excited for all that, and I'll jump off stage to my quality here with this Wi-Fi in the hotel. It's 6 in the morning in Nashville. Is a little wonky, but wish you guys all the best. Excited to meet some awesome people in Nashville. Hit me up if you see me.
Appreciate you for joining us so early, man. Yeah, that's awesome to have you on the ground Thanks so much for joining us super early. Definitely want to hear from you on Monday then, after you get a chance to hear from those huge headliners. Really, it will be, it feels like something's brewing over there. And yeah, I think it will be a big weekend of news coming out of this, to be honest, and very, very excited to kind of get the update on Monday, Tiro. So enjoy yourself. We'll see you on the other side. Let's go to Funky. Welcome to the stage, my friend. What are your thoughts here with this concept of of Bitcoin becoming this strategic asset for the US? Do you think it's likely to happen? I know we're being a bit speculative here, but there's enough people talking about it now for us to start to consider it as a real possibility, I think.
GM Modern Market Fam, hopefully you can hear me
Yep.
okay. So yeah, so there is no second best, right? It goes without saying, Bitcoin Nashville is happening. I'm very hopeful that it becomes the fact. Now, whether or not we're going to actively go out there and buy on the market, but I think like many other Americans, very hopeful that this becomes a strategic reserve asset. I do still harbor the slightest doubt in my mind that we're going to see another Ross Perot situation by having RFK in the race with Trump, because if it does, whereas before everybody just assumed it was just, Trump was going to knock it out of the park when he was versus Biden. Now
Sure.
that he's going to go against Harris, it's going to be closer.
Sure.
Is RFK going to move the needle enough to then tip it to Harris? So that's my biggest concern, and then also speaking to something that you guys were talking about, just sort of the cypherpunk dream dying because TradFi is coming in to kind of co-opt the movement. Personally, I'm okay with that. I'm a pragmatist at the end of the day. I feel like anything that's going to advance the cause of Bitcoin and decentralized money and being, I don't think anybody, even Satoshi Nakamoto, could have foreseen a day even talking about it being a strategic reserve asset. And to the point that you and Sammy already made, if US even does it, forget it, game over. Like every other sovereign nation is going to have to adopt some kind of policy where they're going to have some kind of Bitcoin on their balance sheet. And we can't even comprehend the level of buy pressure that this is going to create. And I think this is where Red Phone Crypto and his essays and points is spot on, because if we do see this turning of the tide, it is going to radically change the world and just everything about it with how people look at Bitcoin. And even now, BBF and I are talking about, like, do we sell any of our Bitcoin or not? Like, we were thinking we'll finally take profit. And we're hearing more and more, like another crypto guy I love, Tyler S. Crypto. He talks about, like, when I cash in profits, I just rotate to Bitcoin. Why keep extra cash, like to your point with the Treasury B, when you're safe and just parking some additional funds in Bitcoin as a long-term savings vehicle? So anyhow, I'll leave it there. I'm sure we have other conversation points to get to, but just wanted to chime in. Thanks.
Yeah, really, really interesting stuff. I agree. I agree with the broad point. Like, it's just a very interesting one to think about. And the reason why I'm stuttering over it is just because it's kind of incomprehensible, isn't it? Like, as you say, the magnitude of what would occur if something like this happened. And again, I appreciate we're kind of speculating, we're kind of thinking about things which are by no means necessarily like happening right here, right now. And there's all kinds of things that would need to happen in order for that stuff to take place. But it's just, it feels like the tides are turning in a meaningful way. But having said that, to your point, to maybe provide a little bit of the other side of this, is that Trump is now, again, it's not a straightforward, it's not as straightforward a route for Trump, I don't think, anymore. Harris provides a different type of competition to Biden. And so we'll have to see how that plays out. So all of this stuff is very intertwined with the decision making and election process in the state. So we'll just have to keep monitoring that as we go through. Sticking on the Bitcoin topic, though, and kind of related to this whole conversation, there was a very interesting point which I pulled out from let me find the right place, the right article here. Right. So this is in the blog, and this is pulled out from someone at BlackRock, the head of digital assets at BlackRock. There's an article. I'm going to share it on the screen for the people who are watching in. There won't be a long list of crypto ETFs, BlackRock's Robert Mitchnick says. So the top little summary is that the BlackRock head of digital assets, Robert Michnick, said at the Bitcoin 2024 conference that the launch of spot Ethereum ETFs is unlikely to open the door to funds that track other crypto assets. ETH is not a Bitcoin competitor, they said. The assets are better seen as complements. Bitcoin's risks are fundamentally different from those of traditional assets, such as banking crises, geopolitical disorder, inflation, deficits, debt, and currency debasement. So when he was explaining why he said, I don't think we're going to see a long list of crypto ETFs, he said, if you think of Bitcoin today, it represents about 55% of the market. ETH is at 18%. The next plausible investable asset is at like 3%. It's just not close to being at the threshold or track record of maturity, liquidity, etc. So the key point being, I know a lot of people are excited about a potential Sol ETF, and Van Eck have even gone ahead of that and made that application. But from the BlackRock perspective, I guess what they're saying is nothing else commands enough mindshare or allocation of capital to bother even thinking about an ETF, because the market is so dominated by Bitcoin and ETH. And so my question for you, Sam, is, do you think this is them shutting the door on other things forever? Or is this just saying, look, we need to focus on these two because that's what the market is demanding at the moment. That's where the liquidity is gone at the moment. This is what we think will perform best. And ultimately, they've got products to sell, right? They've got their ETFs now. They want people to get into them. Providing more at this point would probably be a distraction. I've seen many people actually make the argument that the ETH one was unnecessary because people want them to focus on Bitcoin. So even on some level, you could have given this argument for ETH, right? Which is why I think it's slightly contradictory. Like if you wanted to say, don't bother with anything else, there's not enough liquidity, you probably could have said that about ETH because Bitcoin represents 55% of the market. Just focus on one, but they decided to focus on two. How are you thinking about, this focusing on the two versus everything else not being significant?
Well, I do tend to wonder whether there's like ulterior motives behind the scenes, because ultimately they've just launched the ETFs. They need to make sure those do well, get the volume in there to justify them. And I think to Avi's point yesterday, 4 to 6 weeks is probably a good time frame to get an understanding of how that's doing. But I do think that you need longer than that. I think that the Bitcoin ETFs saw record-breaking amounts of inflows. So I don't think that they're going to be too concerned about that, because they'll be earning decent amounts of fees from those, especially the more liquid ones. I do think that it's not just Van Eck that's filed a Solana ETF application. I think 21 shares. So BlackRock has also done that as well. So I do think that whilst they are saying that ETH and Bitcoin are going to be the dominant ones, I do think there will be more down the line. Larry Fink he outwardly gone against it historically, Bitcoin more widely, and BlackRock have kind of backed that as well. And I think that JP Morgan had a similar stance, but they've done a 180-degree pivot on that. So by these statements being made, I just don't think that they'll hold water a year or 2 years down the line. I think they'll probably end up opening the doors to other crypto ETFs. I just think they'll be selective about which ones, because ultimately ETH's been around for 9 years, Bitcoin's been around for 15 years, and Solana's probably been around for since 2020 or 2021. So yeah, a lot less time. So I think it needs a bit more experience to work out which ones will be good for ETFs going forward, particularly for institutions which have a different risk appetite to your average retail degen.
Yeah, I think that's very fair. That's a reasonable summary. I will probably keep talking about this a little bit more. We've still got 10 minutes left of the show, but let's hit the Web3 roundup to get you up to speed with everything else that's been happening in space in the past 24 hours. As mentioned, there's a lot of Bitcoin pieces of information coming out. So I think there's clearly a focus there at the moment. Number one, Marathon Digital Holdings announces a $100 million worth of Bitcoin purchase. Number two, Jito announces restaking on Solana. They've been pretty successful with their staking on Solana. Next, Mayor of New Jersey announces pension fund to allocate 2% to Bitcoin. This is the second pension fund to announce such a thing, the second one after the one in Wisconsin. Next, FCA fines Coinbase UK £3.5 million pounds, for serving high-risk customers. This is why it's such a pain to operate in crypto in the UK. I think they're being quite difficult with Coinbase there. Next, OpenAI, more on the AI side, launched Search GPT to improve search. I can't help but think this is them trying to capture some of that Google market share. ApeChain announces the largest Arbitrum DEX Camelot will be its native DEX. And finally, Chicago Bulls legend Scottie Pippen to tokenize iconic Game 5 ball, which marked the beginning of the Bulls dynasty. Interesting that he got so much criticism for this in the comments from what I could tell. But I thought, like, this is at least, look, this is a bit more of an attempt of doing something interesting rather than just dropping a token and a ticker and then shilling it to people and doing a normal pump and dump. There's an actual thing there that you can see him holding the basketball. Whether you think that's super valuable or not, like, people are allowed to bring products to market, right? I don't think that's the same as just dropping a ticker and saying, go and do this. And then also simultaneously selling off secret wallets, which I think is what a lot of these prominent people are accused of doing. Like, this is clearly not the same as that. He's not secretly selling a bunch of basketballs on the back of selling this basketball. So I don't know. I thought that was a little bit more reasonable. Sam, do you have a thought on this basketball market?
Well, I think we've seen, was it Boston, so BCG, they talked about the tokenization market cap hitting like 16 trillion as like a conservative estimate by 2030. And that would include assets like this. And I think that like people like to collect stuff. Like we've seen it with like Pokemon cards being tokenized. We've seen it with like baseball cards and NFL, NBA cards all being tokenized, put on chain. Like, why can't you have a basketball? I think my only question would be, where is it custodied, and how do you verify that the token that you're trading can actually be redeemed for the actual basketball? That's the only thing. And I think the likes of Courtyard or those places have Brinks, which is like a legitimate custody sort of system. So yeah, I think just saying you're going to do it is one thing, but doing it in a verifiable way is something that I probably just want to kick the tires on.
Yeah, I think that's pretty fair. Final thing, we've only got 5 minutes left. The key question I was kind of we were thinking about over dinner yesterday, so maybe it's a bit more on the personal allocation portfolio side of things. Maybe following on from the conversation with OSF, who we had on the show yesterday, kind of talking about Bitcoin, how all of these structural changes are happening on the political side, on the regulatory side, on this potential of it being a strategic asset. When you're thinking about Bitcoin, ETH, and Sol, ETH is kind of stuck still. It's got the ETF now, but people seem to be immediately disappointed, which is not uncommon in this space. Let's be transparent. Solana is doing incredibly well. How are you thinking, Sam, about the kind of broad allocation to the major three? Because this could be a point in time where, and it probably has been for the last 6 to 12 months as well, where, you know, if you're in one of the majors opposed to the other, you can do significantly better. And people always say, oh, just be in the majors and you'll be fine. That seems to be like, you know, one of the safer options, but you can clearly outperform other ones depending on how you slice your allocation to the majors. So do you think this Bitcoin news and this energy coming out of the Bitcoin side of things at the moment is so significant that it could take the dominance much higher? How are you thinking about that versus Sol and ETH? Just from a personal, this is all just our opinion now. How are you kind of thinking about that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have much exposure to Bitcoin specifically, and I think I want to change that. And I think, like, just hearing Ovi talk about it yesterday, like seeing all these like pension funds getting involved, they have a significant amount of capital, like assets under management to put in. If they're putting 2% in, like, I don't see any reason why this, like, the total crypto market cap couldn't go to like 100 trillion. And when you're at 2 trillion now, that's a 50x. And if Bitcoin maintains a dominance of 50%, like, that would be insane. So yeah, I think for other assets to get to that kind of size and to throw that dominance off, you'd have to have a lot more ETFs. You'd have to have a lot of like institutional capital, like pension funds, getting into ETH, Solana, AVAX, just to actually maintain that dominance. So yeah, I think Ovi's been pretty good at getting to these things early, like with like Pepe, Bored Apes. Like, he's good at tracking trends, and I think that historically a lot of these things have been sell the news event. But I don't know. I have this feeling that if there's announcements that are made at Bitcoin Nashville, this could be an absolute rip. And I think like Solana at breakpoint in last year in November, December, it was trading at about $30. And then subsequent to that, it went on an absolute tear to about $220, $230 over the next couple of months. So yeah, I think these conferences and meeting people in real life and having these types of speakers that are really passionate about it can actually move dials that have significant influence. So yeah, I'm a little bit torn, but I do think that I need to get some exposure to my portfolio for Bitcoin, maybe like 40% or something, just based on the conversations that I've been having.
Interesting. This is what I'm going to do. I'm not going to. I admit I kind of fall into the bracket of I have exposure to all three. I like all three for all different reasons. I kind of fall into the bracket just like they are the majors. Whatever I feel like at any time is kind of happy. Like I definitely don't like chop and change between them all the time. Like, oh, Sol's looking really good versus Bitcoin. Now I'm going to run into that, and then I'm going to swap over, and then I'm going to swap to ETH. Yeah, I'm not one of those people. But the thing that I'm going to be looking to do, and the thing that's actually been one of the most helpful things for me in the last 6 to 12 months after I read an article by Kobe, was this idea of like probabilistic thinking. And so after whatever happens over the next 2 days and whatever news comes out, whatever kind of rhetoric is presented to people about the potential for stuff. And I actually take someone's point in the comments here. We had Diablito saying, you know, why are people taking this stuff for face value? If Trump says something, it doesn't necessarily mean anything. And look, I think that's a reasonable point. But what I'm going to do after I hear all this stuff is I'll run some type of exercise and try to assign some type of percentage probability to various things happening, whether that's Trump winning, Harris winning. If Trump wins, what's the likelihood that he would implement something like this versus he might win and then not implement something like this? Like, I'm going to try to assign some type of percentage. And look, this could all be completely wrong, right? But that's kind of not the point. The point is that you've gone through the process of actually thinking about the likelihood of certain things happening. And then when you can kind of see that out on a piece of paper or, you know, wherever you choose, wherever I choose to write that down, it just helps me make a decision as to like how I want to allocate. And then, so that's what I think I'll be doing, which I thought I would be helpful to share my process. Because that's helped me a lot when it's come to investing up to this point. Sam?
Yeah, I like that idea. And I think that now we have protocols like Polymarket, all these prediction markets that are popping up. You have more indicators of like what those percentages could be. I see them as like reliable estimates. And I think you've got the wisdom of crowds, where if you have enough people placing a bet on a particular outcome, then it's probably not going to be too far wrong. So I think that the idea of this probabilistic like assigning percentages, chances of things happening, actually you can do that a lot more reliably. So I think we'll probably end up seeing the prediction markets pop off more so than they have done recently, but also there's useful data there and indicators that you can inform your own decision making.
Yeah. Nice. I feel like that's a nice place to leave it for the week. Hope that was an interesting discussion. We dealt with all of the core points I think that's come out of Bitcoin Nashville so far. Some very, very interesting stuff for Bitcoin, as well as some maybe personal reflections on how we're allocating across the board for now. As we said, I think there's going to be more interesting stuff coming out over the weekend. So remember, we will be back on Monday to discuss everything that happens in the NFT market, the crypto market, and just about any other aspect of the market where we think we can make some or ideally a lot of money. We're live on X. We're live on YouTube, 7 a.m. Eastern time. Hope you enjoyed the show. Thank you so much to my legendary co-host, Sammy. Thank you to our contributors, Oxy, Tiro, and Funky up on stage. We hope you have a wonderful weekend. Take care and enjoy. Bye-bye.